What is up, everyone? My name is Joseph, and welcome to another Run Escape podcast, a podcast that really isn't so much a podcast and more of just an organized discussion and an outlet for me to express my opinions on the game we all know and love, RuneScape, and more specifically, old school RuneScape. In this video, we're going to specifically talk about old school RuneScape's polling system and why I don't like it, and why I don't think it's maybe the most beneficial thing for the game. Before we get started, I just want to have a quick disclaimer saying that just really keep in mind that this is an opinion piece. I'm not trying to say that what I'm saying is factual. I will try to back up my statements with some research that I've found, but in general, everything I'm saying is just my opinion. It's how I feel about the game, and it's how I feel about specifically the polling system. If you agree, disagree, or just want to add to the discussion, I am more than willing to read what you have to say in the comments below. I'm generally really open-minded about different points of view, and my opinion can be changed. It's not because I think my opinions are weak. It's more that I'm willing to listen to the viewpoint of others, and I definitely want to hear what you have to say. With that all being said, let's get started into the video on why I dislike the polling system. The first reason I have for disliking the current polling system is that I don't think the polls or the results represent what's best for the longevity of the game. Now, I'm not saying I specifically know what's best, but I do think that there is a large amount of just ignorant voting in most polls. I'm not saying that the people who vote in the polls or the majority are stupid by any means, but what I do think is that just with any polling system or with any update or with any section of the game, there are a number of people who are not fully aware of all the repercussions and all the implications that that update will have towards that specific part of the game. In 2016, Forbes published an interview with Ilya Somin, who wrote a book about the same kind of idea, but in the political scene. I'm not going to touch on the political scene at all, but he did say something that I think kind of held true for the polling system we see in old school RuneScape. He said, no matter how smart we are, all of us are ignorant about the vast majority of information out there. Now, Ilya was talking about politics specifically in this interview and in his book, but I think the same kind of principles carry over to old school RuneScape's polling system. Old school RuneScape is just so immense and so vast, and there's so many intricacies that I don't really think that a deciding number of people, maybe it's not a majority, but it's at least a number that could decide a poll. I think there's a group of people that don't have enough information before voting and are just ignorant of the intricacies that that update will have, whether the markets it will touch, the implications on different skilling methods or anything. I just think that there's a number of people who are just ignorantly voting. And it's not because they're stupid, it's just because they don't know the game as well as, for example, the developers would. They don't have the research, they don't have the data, they really just don't have the experience to vote, and yet they're allowed to. And I'm not saying that they shouldn't be allowed to in the current system. I'm just saying that they are, and there are those kinds of people. And for the example I'm going to use for this point is the recent Wilderness Rejuvenation updates and polls. Now, overall, this was a very controversial topic because it did involve wilderness and PvPing specifically, and there's a lot of controversy and there's a lot of headbutting between those two communities. Now, personally, I've never really PvP'd. I have no desire to, and it's just not something I'm interested in. But I'm not opposed to PvPers getting updates, but I want to make sure they're good updates. And for the recent Wilderness Rejuvenation one, I honestly couldn't tell you whether a lot of those items were very good for the game or harmful for the game, because a lot of what I was seeing in terms of discussion was just either memes or jokes or just one section or one group just being aggressive towards the other. And because of that, I was an ignorant voter. Now, I didn't vote for this reason, but I think a lot of people did vote just based on their initial assumption and in general just ignorantly voted. I don't really think that's anything against those players specifically, but with the amount of polls that come out in old school RuneScape pretty much weekly, it's just almost impossible to keep up to date with everything you need to in order to be educated on all of these polls. And I think the Wilderness Rejuvenation was a little bit unique in that it touched an area that is more controversial than most, being the PvP scene. So I think that kind of just showed these faults at a larger scale. There were a lot of people who were just voting without knowing all the implications, or voting based on, what they personally thought or selfish desires. And that really brings me on to another point, is that people vote selfishly in order to achieve what they want most. And I'm not even really talking about the casual player base with this point either. I will admit that in general, the casual style of player will vote for more easy scape kind of updates, things that make their life easier or make skilling either more AFK or faster. But that's not really what I'm talking about here. What I want to emphasize with this point is that the longevity of the game is not really taken into consideration with these polls. And when people vote in the polls, not only are there ignorant voters, but there are also selfish voters. And I'm going to use two in-game examples of this point, one being towards the higher level community and one being towards the more general public. So in the higher level community, there's a lot of discussion over the Make X update, and more specifically, the one-tick Karam ones. This method of training cooking was possible before the update, but was made a lot easier after the update, especially without the use of AHK. With the Make All update, it was possible to reliably one-tick cook Karambwans without killing your wrist. And like I said, this update had a lot of discussion around it, and specifically in the high-level community. And one conversation I want to touch on is a conversation on Twitter between Randalicious and God Tormentor, two people who are very high on the high scores with multiple 200 mil skills who play this game quite a bit. And I want to use this example to kind of highlight my point of selfish voting. So Randalicious was posting on Twitter that he did not like this update specifically because it made cooking easier. Now, God Tormentor proceeds to call him out, saying that he's a little bit of a hypocrite because he is in favor of Slayer updates, to which Randalicious replies, I'm going to ask for more buffs for what I'm doing and nerfs for what I've done. And I am not really opposed to this view. The way Randalicious is looking at it is from a competitive point of view. He's already finished 200 mil cooking, so now that it's easier, it kind of devalues what he's already done. And I'm not even saying that's a bad thing. That's the way he looks at the game, and that's perfectly fine. But what I do have a problem with is that this type of mindset is able to directly impact game updates. Again, I'm not saying that Randalicious's view is wrong. I think it's important to have clients and users who have different ways of using your software or playing your game, and I think it's good that they voice their opinions, and Randalicious does this a lot, and I think a member of the high-level community like that, I think it's helpful for game development. But again, like I said, I think the fault comes when you let this type of thinking directly influence what comes into the game. People are always going to vote and really want what's best for them, and that doesn't always coincide with what's best for the game itself and the longevity and integrity of the game. Now, another example I want to use for this point, which can probably be more relatable to the casual or general community, is the Nmz Nerf. Now, if you're not aware, back when Nmz was created, you were able to AFK in Nmz for 6 hours without even touching your computer. And this was done because all of the monsters are aggressive in there, so you just kept auto-retaliate on with full Guthans, and you could train for 6 hours until the logout timer kicked you off. Now, obviously, this seems like a pretty immense integrity issue. You're able to progress in the game without actually playing the game. However, when this was polled if this should be removed, it was voted that this should not be touched and should be left the way that it was, which was the ability to play for 6 hours while sleeping or being at work and not even being at your computer. And this is an example of, I think, the general community voting against something for their own selfish desires and not voting with game integrity as their driving focus. And again, I don't think this is bad. I think as a player, personally, I would want what's easiest for me. I want to play this game and progress the easiest way I can. I want to go through life and get the most done that I can. And I think that's a natural and normal thing. But I think where this kind of falls apart is when, again, it directly affects these game updates, and then the game suffers as a result of this. Now, this nerf did actually end up going through much later without a poll, but that just goes to show that these polls are really focused on what players want and what will make their life easier. I do want to stress that I'm not really trying to talk bad about any one person or any specific situation. to single anyone out or to talk bad about them, because I think all of these examples are valid. I think that Randalicious, in his point of view, was a good one. I think that's a good point of view to have in terms of feedback. I think that the Nmz Nerf, I don't agree with it, and I do think it harmed game integrity, but I think the opinions from the community were valid. And I think those are good things to keep in mind. But my points with these examples is to show that people do vote for what makes their life easier. Psychology Today wrote an article on a University of College London study that sums up what my thoughts are pretty well. And although everyone may not vote this way, I, with confidence, say that enough people vote this way to make a difference. And the study that they wrote an article on was that people generally go towards the path of least resistance. They will always take the easiest path if given the option, even if it's subconsciously. People will subconsciously go towards what's easiest for them. And that's normal human nature. And I don't think that's anything to be ridiculed. And I'm not trying to ridicule that about people who vote in polls. But what I'm saying is that it is affecting the game integrity and down the road will cause problems. Getting different views and opinions is what you want from a client or user base. But in my opinion, you run into problems when you have those same people directly influencing the game's direction. People are going to vote selfishly and lean towards the path of least resistance. And while a majority of these polls or updates probably won't have an effect on the longevity of the game, there have been major polls that could lean either way. And this really just keeps the door open to that abuse from the community and just from the natural tendency of human nature, people looking out for themselves and not the game or the company specifically. I personally think in a perfect world, a company should be able to do the research and to have all the variables together to make an educated decision on their updates, with taking community feedback into consideration, but ultimately the business makes that final decision. The business or company's probably the only one with enough knowledge of not only the game, but the business and the marketing side of it to make those decisions, and they should be the ones making the final decision. However, we do run into the issue with this game specifically of Jagex being a somewhat untrustworthy company when it comes to updates. We can see that with updates such as the evolution of combat, the immense microtransactions in RuneScape 3, among other questionable things. And as a community, I think we're rightfully scared or nervous of Jagex having that control, and I really don't know what the perfect answer is. In a perfect world, the business would have all of the information needed from the community, from the business side, and they'd make the decision that's best for not only the longevity of the game, but the integrity as well. Again, it's really hard for me to say what the exact solution would be in old school RuneScape's position, but I do think that in the way that the polling system is set up now, it's kind of destined towards the same future as if Jagex had all the controls. Maybe it's a little bit slower and a little bit less destructive, but I think in the end, having the strict polling system that you have now, due to the reasons that I've mentioned in this point, again, selfish and ignorant voting, I think it's going to just eventually go towards the same path that they would even without the polling system in place. But that brings me onto my next point of why I dislike the polling system. The second reason I don't like the polling system is it gives the community a sense of entitlement, and a sense of entitlement that I don't think they've earned or deserved, and myself included here. Don't get me wrong, I do think that customer and community input is vital for a company or game's success, but having your customer base shape almost every decision you make prevents the opportunity for innovation from Jagex specifically, and it puts the decision making into the hands of the community who, as I mentioned before, have very set ways of voting, such as selfishly voting or ignorantly voting. So you put that control, you take it out of the business's hands or the company's hands and put it into the community, and it gives them that sense of entitlement. Now, I was reading an article recently from Mark Cuban. If you don't know who he is, he's a very successful businessman. Again, you may not agree with the way he does everything, but you can't deny the fact that he has been successful. And in this article, he writes, your customers can tell you things that are broken and how they want to be made happy. Listen to them, make them happy, but don't rely on them to create the future roadmap for your product or service. That's your job. And I think that if you don't do what this article says, what Mark Cuban says in this article, you have this sense of entitlement from the community, and that in turn affects the updates and the progress in the future of the game. Now, I know old school RuneScape is unique in that it is based off, again, a 2007 build, and a lot of people want to stick to that. But realistically, you can't have a business survive by being stagnant. You need to constantly improve and you need to constantly innovate in order to stay relevant in the market and stay relevant as a company. So I don't think that staying stagnant is the right answer. So they do need to push forward, and focusing so much and relying so much on your community stifles that growth. Now, I know that doesn't have a lot to do with entitlement, but I will get to that in a second. So again, it stifles the growth and it gives the power to the community. And what this does is it creates a much harsher environment for the people who are creating the game when an update doesn't go the way the community wants, or even if an update that has passed, there's a community that is very against that. They're much more vocal than in other games. And I think this requires almost too much communication between JMods and the community. Now, I do think it's good to have a good relationship with the community, especially in an online video game where the two are tied so closely together. But in my opinion, the issue arises when you have that community that's tied so closely to the development staff that is entitled. It makes that feedback harsher, which affects future updates and hinders progress. And in my opinion, one of the reasons this happens is that in general, the community just doesn't know as much as they think they do. So when an update doesn't go their way, they only see half the picture, yet they think they know the answer. And since there is such a close relation from the staff to the community, that information and that harsh feedback gets back to the JMods in this situation, and something happens, and maybe it doesn't need to happen. And again, the JMods have in the past diffused situations and straight out ignored situations, and sometimes that's good, sometimes that's bad, but it just creates this hostile environment from the community. I'm kind of speaking from just my experience here. I've played other MMOs, specifically WoW, quite a bit, and I've gone pretty hard and gone pretty far, and been pretty ingrained inside that community. And I have to say that the community in old school RuneScape is just much more toxic, or the toxicity is much more widespread than it is in other MMOs. And I think primarily it's just due to that entitlement, since there's a group of people who think they deserve something. Now, I'm not saying Blizzard is always right with their decisions, and I'm not saying the WoW community isn't toxic at times. But just from what I've noticed and what I've experienced, when something is legitimately wrong, or when an update was legitimately just bad, it was a bad update, bad balancing, it's handled much more calmly. Most recently when I played, I was a priest, and one of the priest specs was just very weird. It's very different from other types of healing, but it fit a niche. And I say weird as just like abnormal. It was different from the other healing specs. And in one of the patches, they decided to almost completely rework it. And the discipline community, the discipline priests community, really just bound together and had legitimate corrections and ways that they would see, or they would want to see, the update take place. And Blizzard listened to those and shaped the update around that. They didn't completely cave to what the community wanted, but there were balances there and there were changes that were made. Now, I'm not saying that this doesn't happen in the old school RuneScape community, because it does. There are a lot of people who make valid arguments and make thought out posts, but it's just so much more cluttered with, I'm not even talking about the memes, just the general toxicity and negativity based on these updates. There's a lot more of it, and it's a lot more prevalent than it is in other communities that I've personally been a part of. And I mean, I can't say this for a fact, again, it's just my opinion, but I think it's because of that entitlement. It's because people expect that because of these polls and because they have the control, they have the right to tell Jagex what they think and that they are right. And they say it in a way that's very, I mean, from what I've seen, demeaning. And I'm not trying to defend Jagex, because they make mistakes quite a bit. But I just think that the entitlement and the repercussions of that entitlement is bad for the community that's there now, but also especially for those new people trying to get into the community. It's just a very hostile environment. And I know there are good parts of the community, and there are some great people who play this game, but I just think the toxicity is just so much more prevalent than in other communities, and I think that will play a part in the decline in popularity in old school when that happens. I'm not saying it's happening right now, but I think that will be a major factor. And again, I to me, it ties back to the polling system because the community is given that sense of entitlement and that sense of power. But that pretty much wraps up my opinions on this part, or this reason why I don't like the polls. And that leads us into our last section of this video. So the last area that I think the polls negatively affect the game is with the game's update creativity. And this point is completely opinion and experience based. So take everything I say with a grain of salt here. But as I was going through school in the beginning of my time at my current job, I just found that when I personally had harsh or strict requirements that were set on me by, the higher ups or my teachers, I was far less creative when it came to design and far less adventurous when it came to specific functionality. If I was making a piece of software or designing a UI or something, I was just much more likely to do exactly what I know needed to get done in order to pass. And I kind of see that happening with some of the updates. I'm not going to say most, and I'm definitely not going to say all, but I can see some similarities when it comes to poll updates or discussion. And that's where I'm trying to satisfy my teachers to pass the class. Some of these updates and re-polling of questions are done to satisfy to the community to get them to just pass the poll. And I'm going to, for a third time, use Wilderness Rejuvenation as an example for this. So there were quite a few changes to the proposed updates and the polls in general as this update was being fleshed out, but I can't help but feel like anything past that original proposal and devblog was very uninspired, and that the changes were made specifically to get those things to pass and to get the community to like it just so they can get it in the game. This may not necessarily be a terrible thing, but just trying to search for the right formula to make that update pass a poll kind of takes the creativity out of this update. This update was originally done by Mod Jed in his tap time, and I think the time he spent on it was well spent. I think having that creative outlet to kind of go and remake a part of the game that was there previously is a good thing, and I think that done right, that can be a positive or solid update. But as the items failed to pass the poll and the feedback was given, the reviews and the revisions that were made to those poll questions were just rehashing the same thing over and over again or making minor corrections. There was no creativity past the initial creation or past the initial blog post or proposal. And everything past that initial block of creativity was just uninspired and was purely to get it to pass a poll. And I think that kind of destroys a little bit on the creativity side because the moderators and the developers are forced to kind of form their content in a way that they know not only will the community like, but the community will vote for it. I think in most games that have constant updates, like MMOs, for example, they do take the community into consideration, but their updates are, what they want to do as a company. And again, old school RuneScape doesn't have this flexibility or this freedom. And I think being kind of bookended restricts that creativity because they do always have to keep in mind 75% of the community not only would be okay with this, but wants this. Because I think in most games, there's a large part of the community that are just okay with things, that doesn't affect me. I don't really like it, but I'm just going to not do it. If that same type of thing was done in RuneScape, those people have a high possibility to vote no, and that activity just doesn't go into the game. No matter how good of an activity it is, if 75% of the people don't like it, it's pretty much gone until they decide to repoll it, if they decide to repoll it. So I do think that the polls in general have a tendency to reduce creativity on some of the updates, and specifically the repolling of updates, and when updates are brought back into circulation after maybe a year or two of being ignored. And I think that's really where the lack of creativity comes into play. But that is really all I have on that topic. Again, that is pretty heavily opinion-based and experience-based on how I personally act and how I personally work on projects. Again, I'm more creative when I have freedom. I know a lot of people who work better under pressure, who are more creative under pressure. So I'm not going to say this is even close to being factual. It's highly opinionated. But at the same time, I do see a lot of my personal tendencies in some of these updates in terms of just lack of creativity and trying to get something to pass. But that is all I have to say on that point, and really all I have to say for this video. I know I may have some controversial opinions stated in this video, but if you do have a different viewpoint or something you want to add, just leave it in a comment below. I do read all the comments, and I'm excited to see what people have to say on this topic. If you did enjoy this video and these types of videos are something you want to see, up in the top right of your screen, there's a little blinking eye. I'm leaving a poll up there for other topics that you may be interested. So go ahead and click on that and vote on one if any of those topics are something that you'd like to hear me talk about. But that is all I have for this video. Again, I hope you guys did enjoy it, and I will see you next time.